It was the kind of place you only end up at when you have no other options. The neon sign outside the Pinecrest Motel buzzed faintly, a few letters flickering on and off as if they couldn't decide whether to work or give up entirely. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for my beat-up sedan and a single truck that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. The building itself was run down, its paint peeling and its windows coated in a thin layer of grime. But it was late. I was exhausted from the long drive, and I told myself it was just a bed for the night. The man behind the counter barely looked at me as I checked in. He had a face that seemed carved out of stone, weathered and unreadable. "Room 13, he mumbled, sliding the key across the counter without making eye contact. For a moment, I hesitated. Room 13? That felt like a bad omen, but I wasn't superstitious, at least not yet. I took the key, thanked him, and made my way down the dimly lit hallway. The room was as depressing as I'd expected. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the bedspread was a dull, floral pattern that looked like it hadn't been changed since the 80s. A small TV sat on a dresser, its screen covered in a fine layer of dust. The single window was covered with heavy, mustard-colored curtains that barely let in any light. The air smelled faintly of mildew, mixed with something metallic that I couldn't quite place. I set my bag down and collapsed onto the bed, the springs creaking loudly beneath me. The room was cold, colder than it should have been given the stuffy air outside, and I wrapped the thin blanket around myself for warmth. I tried to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. It was just a bad motel, I told myself, nothing more. That's when I noticed it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. There was a thin, almost imperceptible seam in the wallpaper near the nightstand, like someone had peeled it back and then pressed it down again. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reached out, running my fingers along the edge. The paper lifted easily, revealing a small, folded piece of paper tucked inside the wall. I frowned, pulling the paper free. It was old, the edges yellowed and brittle, but the writing on it was sharp and clear, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. The words sent a shiver down my spine. "Do not leave the room after 1 a.m. No matter what you hear, stay inside and keep the lights on." I stared at the note, my mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? A joke left by a previous guest to scare the next unlucky occupant? But something about the note felt serious. The handwriting was too precise, too urgent. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. 12:47 a.m. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "It's just a joke," I muttered to myself. But as I folded the note and placed it on the nightstand, I couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in my gut. To distract myself, I turned on the TV, flipping through the static-filled channels until I found something watchable. It was an old black-and-white movie, the kind where the dialogue is awkwardly slow and the background music is far too dramatic. It was comforting in its own way, and I let it play as I leaned back against the headboard, trying to relax. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. Every so often, I found my eyes drifting back to the note, its message repeating in my mind like a warning bell. "Stay inside. Keep the lights on." Then, just as the clock struck 1 a.m., I heard it. A faint sound, like someone walking in the hallway outside my door. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if the person was taking their time. I muted the TV and sat up, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped directly outside my door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The doorknob rattled once, softly, as if someone were testing it. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze, unsure of what to do. The note's warning echoed in my mind. Do not leave the room. I moved as quietly as I could, grabbing the chair from the small desk and wedging it under the doorknob. The footsteps resumed, moving slowly down the hallway, but I couldn't tell if they were heading toward another room or coming back. My pulse was racing, my palms slick with sweat. Then I heard something else, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from the hallway, it was inside the room. I spun around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, soft and unintelligible, as if it were seeping out of the walls themselves. I grabbed the note from the nightstand and stared at it, my hands shaking. I didn't know who had left it or why, but one thing was clear. I should have taken it more seriously. The whispering grew louder, though it was still impossible to make out what it was saying. It wasn't just one voice. It was a tangle of voices, overlapping and weaving together, like a chorus of murmurs just beyond my understanding. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the room and crawling under my skin. I clutched the note in my hand, the paper crumpling slightly under the pressure of my grip. Do not leave the room. No matter what you hear, stay inside and keep the lights on. The lights. A chill ran through me as I realized how dim the room had become. The single lamp on the nightstand was flickering, its bulb buzzing faintly as if struggling to stay alive. I rushed over and shook the lamp, but it didn't stop flickering. The TV, still muted, showed nothing but static now, its faint glow casting strange shadows on the walls. The air grew colder, and the metallic smell I had noticed earlier became stronger, almost suffocating. My breath came in shallow gasps, visible in the icy air. It was as if the room itself had been plunged into a vacuum, cut off from the warmth and safety of the outside world. Then the footsteps returned. They were louder this time, heavier, and they didn't stop outside my door. Instead, they began pacing back and forth, slow and deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was knew I was listening. The doorknob rattled again, more forcefully this time, followed by a soft knock. "Jason," a voice called, muffled but unmistakable. My blood ran cold. That was my name. But there was no way anyone at the motel knew who I was. I'd barely spoken to the man at the front desk, and I certainly hadn't introduced myself. "Jason," the voice repeated, softer now, almost pleading. "Let me in." I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was familiar, but I couldn't place it. It sounded like someone I knew, someone I trusted, but there was something off about it, something too smooth, too rehearsed. "Who is it?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver down my spine, it said, "It's me. Open the door." I shook my head, tears welling up in my eyes. I didn't know who or what was on the other side, but every instinct screamed at me to stay where I was. The lamp flickered violently, plunging the room into near darkness for a moment before the light stabilized again. The voices, the whispers, returned, louder now, and the walls seemed to tremble with the weight of them. I stumbled back to the bed, clutching the note like it was some kind of talisman. "Do not leave the room." I repeated the words in my head over and over, trying to drown out the whispers. Then, without warning, the TV turned off, plunging the room into silence. The lamp stopped flickering, its light steady once more. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought whatever was outside the door had given up. But then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the edge of the lamp's glow, a shadow began to take shape. It wasn't cast by anything in the room. It was independent, growing and twisting like smoke curling into the air. My breath caught in my throat as the shadow solidified, forming the outline of a figure. The whispers grew louder, the words still incomprehensible but now filled with urgency. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, and as it entered the light, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a man, or at least it had the shape of a man. Its features were blurry, shifting like static on a screen, and its eyes were empty voids, blacker than anything I had ever seen. "Jason," it said, its voice a distorted echo. I scrambled back onto the bed, pressing myself against the headboard as the figure advanced. It stopped at the foot of the bed, tilting its head slightly as if studying me. "You shouldn't have found the note," it said, its voice layered with multiple tones, some high, some low. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it reached out with one hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, and pointed to the note in my hand. "Follow," it said. Before I could react, the lamp flickered again and went out, plunging the room into total darkness. The whispers became deafening, rising to a crescendo that made my ears ring. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel the figure standing there, its presence pressing down on me like a weight. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The lamp flickered back to life, its weak glow filling the room. The figure was gone. But the note had changed. The neat handwriting was gone, replaced by jagged, uneven scrawls that looked as though they had been written in a hurry. The new message was simple. "It's not over. You have to finish this." I stared at the note, my hands trembling. The jagged handwriting was a stark contrast to the neat, precise script I had found earlier, as if it had been written in a panic. "It's not over. You have to finish this." Finish what? My mind raced, grasping for answers, but I came up empty. The room was silent now, save for the faint hum of the lamp. The air felt heavier than before, as though the presence of the shadowy figure had left an imprint on the atmosphere. I didn't want to move, didn't want to touch anything, but the words on the note pulled at me, demanding action. I stood slowly, clutching the note as I surveyed the room. Something caught my eye, a faint glimmer of light reflecting off the mirror above the dresser. I hadn't noticed it before, but there was something etched into the glass, barely visible in the dim light. Steeling myself, I approached the mirror, my heart pounding with every step. The etching was rough, as if someone had scratched it into the glass with a sharp object. It formed an arrow, pointing downward toward the dresser. Beneath it, in faint, almost invisible letters, was a single word: "Look." I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to leave the room and never look back. But the note had said I needed to finish this, and something told me that leaving now wouldn't solve anything. Slowly, I opened the top drawer of the dresser. Inside was another note, folded neatly on top of a stack of old, yellowed papers. I unfolded it with trembling hands, revealing more of the sharp, jagged handwriting. "The answers are buried. Check the floorboards under the bed. You must not stop now." I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. The instructions were getting more specific, more urgent, and the ominous feeling in the room only deepened. I glanced at the bed, dread curling in my stomach like a living thing. Kneeling down, I reached beneath the bed, my fingers brushing against the cold, dusty floorboards. At first, I didn't feel anything unusual. but then my hand hit a loose board. It wobbled slightly under the pressure of my touch. My breath hitched as I wrapped my fingers around the edge and pried it up. Beneath the floorboard was a small metal box. It was old, rusted around the edges, and covered in strange symbols that looked eerily similar to the ones I had seen etched into the mirror. The box was locked, but the key was taped to the underside of the floorboard. I ripped it off and slid it into the lock, my hands shaking. The box creaked open, revealing its contents: a faded photograph, a newspaper clipping, and yet another note. The photograph was black and white, worn and faded with time. It showed a group of people standing in front of a building that looked strikingly similar to the motel. They were all smiling, but something about their faces made my skin crawl. Their eyes were too wide, their smiles too sharp, as though they were forcing themselves to appear normal. The newspaper clipping was even more unsettling. The headline read, "Mysterious Disappearances at Pinecrest Motel. Guests vanish without a trace." I skimmed the article, my blood running cold as I read about a string of unexplained disappearances that had occurred at the motel over several decades. Guests would check in, but never check out. No bodies were ever found, and the police eventually stopped investigating, chalking it up to transient behavior or people running away from their lives. My hands trembled as I unfolded the final note. It was written in the same jagged script as before. "They're trapped here. We're all trapped. The room holds the key. The mirror will show you the way." The mirror. I turned to face it, dread pooling in my stomach. The glass seemed darker now, its surface faintly rippling like water. The arrow and the word "look" were still etched into it. But now, as I approached, I could see something else. Movement. My reflection wasn't moving the way I was. It stood there, staring back at me with an expression that didn't match my own. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and its lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. A faint whisper filled the room again, this time coming from the mirror itself. "Finish it." I stumbled back, the photograph and newspaper clipping slipping from my hands. The mirror rippled again, and for a brief moment, I saw something behind my reflection. A dark hallway stretching endlessly into the void. I wanted to run, to leave the room and never come back. But the note's words echoed in my mind. "The room holds the key. The mirror will show you the way." Whatever nightmare I had stumbled into, there was no escaping it now. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stared at the mirror, its surface shimmering like the surface of a pond disturbed by a single drop. The dark hallway behind my reflection beckoned, its edges swirling with shadows that seemed to shift and breathe. The faint whisper repeated, low and melodic, weaving itself into the air. "Finish it." I wanted to look away, to step back, but my body wouldn't listen. It was as if the mirror had latched onto me, pulling me closer with an invisible force. My reflection stared back, its movements no longer mirroring mine. It tilted its head, its expression unnervingly calm, and then, without me moving, it raised its hand and pointed toward the dresser. The message was clear. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. I forced myself to look at the dresser again, hoping the room's dim light would mask the growing fear that twisted in my chest. The photograph and newspaper clipping I had dropped lay scattered on the floor, their edges curling slightly as if the room itself was aging them further. I picked them up with trembling hands and placed them back inside the rusted box, unable to shake the feeling that the objects didn't belong to me, or to anyone alive. The mirror rippled again, pulling my attention back. This time, the dark hallway was clearer, its jagged walls lined with what appeared to be countless photographs like the one I'd found in the box. Faces stared out from the glassy surface, their eyes wide and their expressions frozen in terror. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was seeing. They weren't photographs at all. They were reflections trapped within the mirror. A sudden sound shattered the stillness. It was faint at first, like distant footsteps, but it quickly grew louder, closer. The sound was coming from the hallway in the mirror. My reflection was gone now, replaced entirely by the endless corridor, and the footsteps echoed like a drumbeat in the emptiness. "Finish it," the whisper came again, louder this time, almost urgent. The dresser's top drawer creaked open on its own, the sound sharp and jarring in the heavy silence of the room. Inside, there was only one object, an old, tarnished key. It was long and slender, its handle intricately carved with symbols that matched the ones on the rusted box. I hesitated before reaching for it, my hand trembling as I grasped the cold metal. The moment I touched the key, the lamp flickered violently, casting the room in shadows that seemed to stretch and claw at the walls. The mirror's surface rippled again, and the hallway within began to shift. The photographs along the walls flickered out, replaced by dark doorways that seemed to open into nothingness. "Go," the whisper commanded. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my throat was dry, and my voice refused to come. My feet moved of their own accord, carrying me closer to the mirror. The air grew colder with every step, and by the time I stood directly in front of it, I could see my breath fogging the surface. The mirror wasn't just a reflection anymore, it was a doorway. The dark hallway stretched endlessly before me, and the footsteps were louder now, echoing with each step I took. I clutched the key tightly, the metal digging into my palm, and stared into the void. "Step through," the whisper said. It was no longer a suggestion, it was a command. I reached out tentatively, my fingers brushing the surface of the mirror. It felt cold and wet, like icy water, and the moment my hand passed through, a wave of nausea hit me. I pulled back instinctively, my breath hitching, but the mirror didn't let go. It pulled at me, drawing me forward until I was swallowed whole. The air on the other side was thick and suffocating, like a heavy fog pressing against my skin. The hallway was darker than it had appeared from the room, its jagged walls pulsating faintly with a sickly, greenish light. The doorways that lined the corridor loomed on either side, each one radiating an unsettling energy that made my stomach churn. I walked slowly, the sound of my footsteps echoing unnaturally, as though the hallway were amplifying the noise. The key in my hand felt heavier now, its intricate carvings glowing faintly in the dim light. The first doorway I passed was open just enough for me to glimpse what lay inside. It was another room, identical to the one I had just left, but empty, save for a mirror on the far wall. I peered closer, and my blood turned to ice. My reflection was there, staring back at me from the room inside the doorway. It smiled, tilting its head in the same unnerving way I had seen earlier. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than before, overlapping in a cacophony that made my ears ring. They urged me forward, their words blending into a single command. "Find the door. Lock it." The key grew warmer in my hand as I moved deeper into the hallway, passing more doorways, each one revealing glimpses of impossible, twisted realities. One room was filled with flickering shadows that seemed to dance to a soundless rhythm. Another was empty except for a chair, which faced a blank wall where faint scratches spelled out, "Help me." Finally, I reached the end of the hallway. A single door stood before me, massive and ornate, its surface covered in the same strange symbols as the key. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the air around the door pulsed with an energy that made my skin crawl. I knew what I had to do. The door at the end of the hallway loomed before me, towering and ancient, its dark surface pulsating faintly as though it were alive. The symbols carved into it glowed faintly, matching the ones etched into the key in my hand. The whispers that had guided me here were now deafening, overlapping in a frantic, incomprehensible chorus. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I knew there was no going back. Not anymore. The key felt heavy, almost burning in my palm. As I lifted it toward the door, the air around me grew colder, and the entire hallway seemed to tremble. The flickering light from the jagged walls dimmed, and I was plunged into near darkness. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. My breath was ragged as I pressed the key into the lock. The metal clicked into place with a sound that echoed unnaturally, reverberating through the hallway like a gunshot. For a moment, nothing happened. The door stood motionless, its surface cold and unyielding. Then it began to open. The door creaked loudly as it swung inward, revealing an abyss beyond. It wasn't just darkness, it was something deeper, something endless, as though the door was a gateway to a void that existed outside time and space. The air rushing out from the opening was frigid and heavy, carrying with it the faint metallic scent that had lingered in my motel room. My stomach turned as I stared into the void, unable to comprehend what I was looking at. And then, something moved within the darkness. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of motion at the edge of the abyss. But as I watched, the shadow grew, solidifying into a figure. It was tall and thin, its limbs impossibly long and its movements jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, a blank slate that radiated a malice I could feel in my bones. I stumbled back, clutching the key tightly as the figure stepped forward. Its presence was overwhelming, a crushing weight that pressed against my chest and made it hard to breathe. The void behind it pulsed, and the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. But now, they weren't guiding me. They were warning me. Close it. Close the door. Lock it now. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the key, my fingers numb from the cold. The figure continued to advance, its featureless face tilting slightly as though it were studying me. The closer it came, the more the whispers dissolved into a singular, frantic plea. "Lock the door!" I shoved the door with all my strength, forcing it closed just as the figure reached the threshold. Its elongated hand shot out, gripping the edge of the door with unnatural strength. My breath caught in my throat as I saw its fingers, thin and spindly, with nails that looked more like claws. With a desperate cry, I raised the key and pressed it against the glowing symbols on the door. The carvings flared brightly, and the figure recoiled, its hand jerking back into the void. I didn't waste a second. I slammed the door shut and turned the key in the lock, sealing it with a final, resounding click. The hallway shook violently, and the air was filled with an ear-splitting scream that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I stumbled back, my hands pressed to my ears as the door began to glow brighter and brighter. The symbols etched into its surface pulsed rhythmically, their light growing until I could no longer look at them. And then, silence. The glow faded, and the hallway returned to its dim, pulsating state. The door was still there, but now it looked dull and lifeless, as though whatever power it had once held was gone. The key in my hand crumbled into dust, its purpose fulfilled. I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The oppressive energy that had filled the hallway was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. But even as I sat there, trembling and exhausted, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the nightmare wasn't truly over. When I finally made my way back through the hallway, the doors I had passed earlier were all sealed. The mirror in my motel room was dark and cracked, its surface reflecting nothing but shadows. The lamp on the nightstand had gone out, and the air in the room was thick and stifling. I grabbed my belongings and fled, not bothering to check out. The motel felt like a prison now, its walls closing in around me, and I couldn't get to my car fast enough. As I drove away, the faint glow of the motel's neon sign disappeared into the distance, and for the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe again. But the relief was short-lived. Later that night, as I sat in my apartment, I noticed something strange. The crumpled note I had taken from the motel wasn't in my bag. I searched everywhere, turning the room upside down, but it was nowhere to be found. Then, just as I was about to give up, I saw it, folded neatly on my desk as if it had been placed there deliberately. My hands shook as I unfolded it, revealing a single, chilling message written in the same jagged handwriting. "It's not over." The whispers returned that night, faint and distant, but unmistakable. And when I looked in the mirror, I saw the dark hallway once more, waiting for me.